Slam poetry.
He doesn't care if it's perfect.
It's time to slam now.
It's the biggest poem I've got inside of me.
She was a thief. You gotta
Love means to love a haunted house.
Yelling, angry.
Blood black nothingness began to spin.
Specific point of view on
To
things.
this day, I hate pork chops. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
If you've ever found yourself on the fringes of slam poetry, you are not alone. Welcome to I Think Therefore I Slam, the podcast bringing you the best spoken word and slam poetry artists from Australia and beyond. My name is Andrew Rogerson and I'm feeling particularly giddy today. My guest today is somewhat a favourite of mine, someone I've been wanting to speak to for a long time now. My guest is a 3-time Australian Poetry Slam National Finalist, a spoken word poet and the author of 3 collections. The most recent one, The Fossil of Us, is out now. His live show, This Is How We Survive, weaves original poetry and storytelling with cinematic short films, exploring what it means to keep showing up when the world feels dark. His work is motivated by a deep conviction that story is at the heart of human connection. As the founding director of Lead by Story, my guest brings that belief to a diverse portfolio of social impact projects, directing fundraising campaigns, producing short films, and creating work for stage, page, and screen that stays with people. His clients include some of Australia's leading not-for-profit organisations. He also hosts Spiritual Misfits, a podcast for people exploring faith from the fringes. Will Small, this feels like Christmas has come early. Welcome on.
Oh, Andrew, thank you so much for having me. Sorry that you had to read that long bio. I'm glad it feels like Christmas. I'm excited to be here too.
I've read longer, so that one was okay. No tongue twisters there. Well, the good thing is, I'm talking to another podcaster, so, you've already got one of the most professional, best-sounding setups I've ever heard. It's like you're in a... Have you got any soundproofing there, can I ask? Have you got anything on the walls?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. This is a little studio that we built in the front yard. And so it does have some acoustic treatment on the walls, and it's also just like the little escape.
Yeah.
The escape zone from my 3 kids and our crazy dog. Not my wife. I don't need to escape from her, but we kind of tag team who gets to come out here and have a bit of respite.
Scream at the walls if you need to. No one else can hear it. That's the dream, mate, to have just a little man cave where you've got everything there. So hopefully one day I'll join you in the sun in that way. Will, we're so keen to hear some of your work which you've brought with you today. We'd love to start off with your first piece.
All right. Well, when we're recording, I'm days away from releasing this book. By the time it comes out, it will be out in the world, as you've just kind of mentioned. So I appreciate the way that you did that. Now I'm kind of like date stamping us in the past, but about to put out this new book called The Fossil of Us. And I thought I'd start with the first poem in the book, which is called Hills Hoist. My love's been out in the garden, coaxing life forth in 2-metre squared plots, while I've been lost in my grey matter, gaming out ways the world might collapse. I'm out with a basket, pegging clothes on the line, laundry list of risks spinning a Hills Hoist in my mind. Ecological crisis, spiritual blindness, superintelligence, misaligned, malevolent. Jesus, it's me again. You listening? How long until the meek receive their inheritance? Been days since I've picked up the dog shit. I promise tomorrow I'll get round to it. Kids are in the tub, bath bomb in the water. I smell its sweet musk through the screen door. Pull the youngest one up with a crisp towel. Feel his warm skin on my cheek. My boy, I often wonder what awaits you. When you're my age, what will remain? Can we turn this ship before the light fades? For now, your mama's out in the garden, tending life, 2 square meters at a time.
Beautiful. Nothing like a bit of slice of life. Australiana is what I'm kind of...
Yeah, that's right.
You're out at kind of Central Coast, aren't you?
Yes. Central Coast, 2250. Represent.
Postcode, shout out. Lovely, mate. Yes, very excited for the new collection. My pre-order's done. We're going to be talking about it a lot more. But just before we do, can you take us back before this moment here and let us know what is the origin story of you starting to create and share your poetry work? Does it have something to do with you setting out on a journey to become the greatest rapper of all time? I've heard whispers. I've heard murmurings.
Yeah, well, my origin story, I feel like I've told it a lot of times because I go in and do poetry stuff in schools. And so I've got to have like a pretty, compelling little origin story to tell. And I might be speaking to a room of year 8 students and I sort of tell them that that's where it all began for me, was when I was in year 8, when I was, around 14 years old, and a friend of mine burnt me a CD, which is a sentence that doesn't make sense in 2026. But, shared music with me, and that CD was a collection of songs by Tupac.
Yeah.
I went home, and for context, here I was going to a private school. I lived in a comfortable Canberran suburban house. My life was pretty cruisy. And I just remember being so hooked, hearing this black man from America rapping about poverty and racism and, the injustices of the world, but also just having this sort of like this amazing confidence and incredible storytelling ability. So I was hooked. Tupac was like the gateway drug, but more broadly, hip hop was what really got into me. And I should say that before that, my mum in her working life was a librarian. And so words were always
so
the
cool.
thing for me. Yeah. So right from day dot, I was raised with a deep appreciation for the power of books, of stories, of words in all forms. But hip hop's the particular format that really grabbed me when I was in those formational teenage years. And as you said, I wanted to become an amazing MC. I wanted to be the next Hilltop Hoods or Eminem or, pick your favorite. Sort of 17, 18, that was kind of the dream. I was, at school kind of like picking battle raps with the one other kid I could find who would do that kind of thing. And I had an English teacher who sort of actually encouraged me, hey, Will, why don't you consider entering a poetry slam? She had this like poster on the classroom notice board for the Australian Poetry Slam. This is one of the very early years of the Australian Poetry Slam running. This would have been back in 2007 or...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 2007. So I just went along and just did a rap without a beat. And that night, really, I'd never seen that format before. And not many people, I think, in Australia had at the time, sort of just 2 minutes, energetic crowd, anybody can sign up. You got this real diversity of voices and poets. And I met Omar Musa at that first slam that I went to. And, I'm sure your listeners will know if they're familiar with the Australian poetry scene. Omar is one of the goats. And he really encouraged me to keep finding my voice. And I look back and I think, man, those early pieces that I shared were very embarrassing, but I'm grateful that I had enough confidence to do it because I then continued to do that. And it's kind of just been something that's stayed with me through all the evolving seasons of my life between now and then.
Yeah, fantastic. Can I ask, what was it like for you when, Tupac briefly came back as a hologram? Like, was that a big moment or was it a bit horrific?
I was, I'm also a bit of a nerd. I love sci-fi. So, seeing Tupac kind of take on the form of like Qui-Gon Jinn on like a hollow chip reader in Star Wars is kind of a mashup of all my favorite things, you could say. But part of what is amazing about Tupac, and, I encountered him at a formative stage in my life, but he died when I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
He already had this like mythological status. Anything to do with him, I was fascinated by, whether he's in hologram form or not. But he's almost like he's always been a hologram because he's always been this kind of like ghostly, otherworldly, sort of transcendent presence.
And look, if film technology is any indication, this might become more common. I mean, I'm hearing about Val Kilmer's family basically signing over the rights to have him or his essence or whatever star in films posthumously. It's a whole new world.
We're living in wild times. Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen next? I mean, you mentioned like inciting incident. I'm always interested in, where people get started. And I like to compare and contrast because for you, it was hip hop. For me, it was a combination of like musical theater crossed with like whiny white boy emo music. So it couldn't be more different. But hey, sometimes you just end up in the same culture, and that's the way it is.
That's what I love about it. That's why I still obviously love hip hop. But there was a time where I was sort of like almost on the fence between, am I a rapper or am I a poet? And then there's questions of, am I a spoken word poet Or am I just a poet and sometimes it's spoken? But I think one of the things that really I love about the spoken word poetry world is the diversity.
Yes.
That you have people that have, very different fashion sense, music styles that they're interested in, and it naturally lends itself to a bit more of a broad, eclectic expression of community.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't have it any other way, I don't think. But yeah, let's start to rev up the hype train if we can. The newest collection of yours is titled The Fossil of Us. I really like the title. Reminds me a bit of that song by Chet Faker and Marcus Marr, but also reminds me of, or rather brings to mind, humanity's legacy. Like what, if we get dug up thousands of years from now, what exactly are people going to find? And how fragile are we in the big scheme of things? Can you tell us like what kind of themes or stories or philosophical explorations can we expect from your third collection?
Yes, definitely. So the title of the book, and I guess the seed for the book, comes from this moment that I had when I was in the Natural History Museum in London, and I was holding my toddler and walking around and feeling like a kid myself, to be honest, because the Natural History Museum is just an incredible place. And I'm walking past, like these kind of like molten lava images of volcanoes and Pompeii and, different kind of historical civilizations collapsing. And I walk down this corridor that's got all these, kind of like dinosaur bones, and just found myself reading this little, placard that basically spoke about this moment 65 million years ago when 66% of life on Earth went extinct, which is a pretty wild thing to think about, particularly because we're in a moment where some people talk about the extinction possibilities, particularly for humans. They're kind of like, it's a real risk.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of had this moment of just like being stopped in my tracks and thinking, there will come a time, maybe, when somebody, whether it's a human, a robot, an alien, is looking at the mark that we left behind in the way that I'm looking at what was left in the rocks, millions of years ago, which is a wild thought. I just think we live in such a strange time right now. And I guess a lot of the writing that I do is trying to wrestle with how do you get your head around this sort of huge global phenomena that we observe through our little screens, and the very intricate and intimate lives that we live in our own little patches, with our own plants in the backyard and, neighbors across the fence, and our lives, how do we kind of like hold the macro and the micro? So that's a lot of what the book is trying to do. And most of it kind of dwells on the micro, on the ordinary, but with this, I guess, macro picture in the background, and these kind of existential philosophical questions around, what will I leave behind as a dad and a husband and a poet, but what will we leave behind as a society, as a culture? So the book kind of is structured in like 4 little movements. The first section is called The Fossil of Us, and it is those poems about this moment and the kind of existential kind of wrestling mixed with the domestic. The second section of poems is called Unconventional Wisdom and Conventional Folly, which for a while I had up my sleeve as something that I would maybe use as a book title in itself, but they're kind of like poems that just like basically make fun of the things that we take very seriously and take seriously the absurd and ridiculous things. It's kind of like trying to flip that sense of, we do a lot of really dumb stuff that's kind of just conventional, but often wisdom is found in the unconventional ways of looking at things. So they're kind of satirical, fun, playful poems. And then it's a bit of an emotional journey because the third section of the book is called The Grass Doesn't Stop Growing for the Dead. And they're poems about grief and about loss and about what we do when we experience, whether it's the loss of a family pet or whether it's the loss of someone we love very dearly, how we find beauty and keep going. And then the fourth section of the book is called Should You Wake Before the Sun? And those are poems that are basically kind of this insistence that even as life can be unpredictable and scary and chaotic, we keep going, we keep looking for the light, we keep speaking words of blessing over our kids, trying to close, I guess, in the realm of a benediction, you know, a kind of parting word that sends somebody out into the world, hopefully a little bit more lighter. So those are the movements of the book, and I'm very excited to get it in people's hands.
I'm excited to read it. I'm very keen to see what it's all about. Do you feel like, you know, through putting together this collection, do you feel like you're any closer to answering some of those questions in terms of what do you think is going to outlast your lifetime, or do you feel like you're still arriving there?
I try to have a pretty healthy dose of humility. We always think that we're at the center of the story, right? We always think that we're at the peak of history. I heard somebody ask this question once on a podcast that really stood out to me. Like, we tend to think that we're living in late history, but there's every chance that this is the very beginning of life as we know it in this universe. And maybe there'll be people, you know, billions of years from now. Like, we just don't know. So I like to think about things like that kind of just help you to have this big zoom out. So yeah, I don't have answers, but I think I have a greater sense of, even though life feels incredibly uncertain, and I'm personally, like, I've been very gripped by questions and anxieties and curiosities about AI, as well as about just the current global geopolitical kind of fragility. Definitely the headlines tend to get stuck. You know, I get grabbed by that kind of overwhelming cycle. But I suppose my kind of answer, and I think even writing poetry is a part of this, is that you just have to live your life.
Yeah.
At a small scale, but at that small scale, you have to try and be as kind and courageous and loving as you can. And certainly if you've got any kind of platform or influence or political power, then use all of that you can. But in a time when so many people feel disempowered and very small, I want to kind of say, actually, the small is where it's at. Like, the loving act that you can do in your local neighborhood that no one notices, maybe that is the wisest thing for you to do, and not post about it, you know, and not have it doesn't have to be witnessed by some digital sphere to matter.
Yeah, I mean, right now I feel like I could spend the rest of the year in a room just thinking about how much I feel like I'm at the mercy of so many things that are just beyond all of our control. That's a wild thought about, you know, this being the start of history, maybe not the end. That makes me feel very, very small in a good way, I suppose. I think it was Anne Lamott who has this saying of, like, 100 years from now, it's all new people. And I think it's meant to be to keep perspective. But I think the nature of us poets is that, I don't know, deep calls to deep, and there's something that we're trying to come to conclusions about in terms of our place in the world. And I think the questions are the points sometimes. It's not necessarily, you know, arriving somewhere solid and going, that's it. There's a rich vein that we can tap into. I Think Therefore I Slam is brought to you by the Slam Fam on Patreon. Yes, these are the generous, beautiful, creative souls who help keep the lights on here at Podcast HQ. And for less than the price of a coffee a month, they get access to all types of exclusive goodies, including bonus episodes, previews of upcoming content, new poems and musings from me, and much more. To become a member, you can head on over to patreon.com/ITTIS or click the link in the description. Now back to the conversation. Will, I want to talk about the fact that, you know, you're not just a poet, you're also a keen podcaster, and you do host the Spiritual Misfits podcast, which I've been a big fan of for a number of years. And you even planted like kind of an alternative church community for people who relate to the moniker of Spiritual Misfits. The first thing I want to say is that I was saying to you earlier that I feel like your podcast reminds me a lot of the first podcast that I ever really kind of connected with. And it was part of that wave of mostly American-based groups who were talking about, I guess, what we could call progressive Christianity. It just kind of opened up a whole new world of thinking for me. And I really appreciate that there's something in an Australian context, because there's one thing we know, the Australian context is very, very different to American evangelicalism and everything that goes down. I want to zoom in on the misfits of it all, though. Do you think that poets and creatives, are we just like inherently misfits in mainstream society. Do you find that this community you've planted is made up of people who lean into the artistry of it all?
Misfits, as I've discovered over the last few years, is a really interesting word. A lot of people feel like a misfit for a lot of different reasons. And people that you might think, that person's not a misfit, you don't know what's going on in their interior world. And people that might seem really confident in one sense might have a deep sense of feeling out of alignment with a lot of the systems that they exist within. I think that is often where a lot of art springs from, right? Is some sort of tension or misalignment between something in your interior and what you observe in the exterior. And that can be what produces angry, justice-y kind of, activistic poems. But it can also be just that moment where you pause and you notice something really beautiful. And for me, you can almost go like, how did I even end up here in this wild, beautiful tapestry of life? Like, just what are the chances? So I kind of do feel like there is something about whether you're a songwriter or a poet or, someone who tries to craft stories, often it does come from some sense of inner tension or misalignment. Part of what I find interesting about the whole idea of playing with the word misfit is that I have a deep belief that everyone and everything, belongs in some sense. And that might sound simplistic, and I don't mean to be reductionistic, but I do feel like I kind of genuinely believe that we are all deserving of a seat at the table and of human dignity. Anybody who's been made to feel like they don't belong or been made to feel like they shouldn't have a seat at the table, well, that's just not true. That's a lie. I sort of think that everyone does. But the problem is that because of the way that we interact with each other, so many of us have some inner feeling of lostness or of, feeling alone, even if we're in a crowded place. And you can have that and live a healthy and balanced life, but still have these moments where you kind of feel like, I think that's just part of the human condition, right? We all, I think, if we're honest, have moments of feeling a great ache within us or a longing within us or a aloneness. But that's why I think it's a great word to use to kind of draw people together and say, if you've ever felt like this, let's gather around this term or around this feeling, and then let's remind each other that actually we belong. So I had this little, I wrote a chapter in a book about some of the work that we've been doing, and I opened it by saying, what's the collective noun for a group of misfits? There's collective nouns for, you got a flock of geese or a murder of crows. They get the coolest collective noun, the crows. But I would like to say the collective noun for a group of misfits is a belonging of misfits.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's interesting that if you pick any point on the planet Earth and you start walking away from it in a straight line, let's assume that you can walk over water as well. Eventually, you kind of end up back at it, right? If you're a tuning fork and, you change your frequency, sorry, I don't know how tuning forks work, eventually you're going to start ringing on the same frequency as other things. If you're a planetary body and you leave the orbit of something, eventually you'll start surrounding something else where other things are kind of going around it. I just think it's interesting that, and this can have good and bad consequences where I think we hunger and we ache for community. We hunger and we ache for tribe and our people. And in the worst aspects, sometimes we'll find belonging in like gangs and violent places. Do you know what I mean? You mentioned like the ache of feeling different, because I've experienced that ache, if you like. And I have trouble with it because I think sometimes I like that ache. And I become very attached to it because I go, oh, well, that's what makes me a bit different and a bit whatever. And that's nice. Like I like that feeling. But there are so many other times where I just want to be a person. I just want to not think so much about stuff, because I think the more that you reinforce the fact that I'm so ... the more that you separate yourself from other people. When people rock up at Meeting Ground, this church community that you've established, like what do you find that they are looking for? What do you think that they've come from? Do they often come from backgrounds of being told that they don't belong?
Well, when we started this little faith community, I guess we started it because I felt like I was at the time working at a more mainstream church. I was working as a pastor. I sort of observed this trend of friends of mine leaving the church. This was around the time of the plebiscite. But even, you don't need that. There's so many reasons to leave the church. There's so many reasons to want to walk away from the hypocrisy or the ugly side of humans expressed in religious settings, which is the same ugly side of humans expressed in many settings. But yeah, there's plenty of reasons to want to leave. But I guess I felt like a lot of people were leaving in one sense, but they weren't in another. Like they weren't leaving their deeply held values that they'd grown up with that were about justice and were about loving their neighbor and loving the sacred ground that they walked on and loving, the creator, if there is a creative energy that made all of this. They weren't necessarily leaving that, right? But they were leaving institutional small-mindedness. And I know there are plenty of churches out there that are amazing places of community and goodness. So I don't want to just paint it with I'm by no means anti-church or anti-religion. I just think that humans, we are very complicated creatures, and the hardest thing to do is to be in community, and the most important thing to do is to be in community. So anyway, we started basically with the premise of, could we create a church where you could come with doubt, a church where you didn't have to believe anything, and where it's okay if you don't arrive back at the right answers, but that if you just kind of find yourself constantly wrestling, then this would be a place where you would be accepted in that wrestle. Or if you found yourself, with a perspective that put you outside of the kind of Sunday school answer, then that'd be okay. We can hold different views and opinions. So that was kind of the aim. And what's interesting to me is that we had a lot of people come at the beginning. They'd left church or they were on the edge of church and they saw what we're doing and they wanted to come back for the reasons that I said before around still being something lingering within them. But for a lot of those people, they ended up moving on anyway. And actually we were kind of like I like to think of it as we were like the last safe stop on the way out. And they were kind of going to head out anyway, but we didn't leave a terrible taste in their mouth like some other last stops might. These days, what I've observed, because we've been leading this little community for about 6 years, and it's very ordinary, really. It's just a group of people that meet and drink coffee and talk about the mysteries of life and do our best to look out for each other. It's quite ordinary, but there's something quite beautiful about that. And those that come these days, I think they're looking for that ordinariness. They're looking for the consistency and the regularity of whether I believe this week or I don't, whether I'm confident this week or I'm not, whether I'm feeling crushed or I'm feeling grateful or both. I've got a place where I can come and just have conversations in somebody's lounge room. And, our kids can be kind of in that space too. And it's safe and intergenerational. And so I don't think we're doing anything particularly remarkable, and I don't know what grand hopes people might come with, but often, interestingly, they have listened to the podcast. Most people these days that discover our little community, because we don't have a website or really advertise it. We're pretty underground. But people will listen to the podcast, hear about this community, and if they're on the Central Coast or they're moving to the Central Coast, they'll kind of say, can we come and check it out? And I try to temper their expectations and say it's pretty ordinary, but yes, you are very welcome to come and check it out.
Well, I'm sure for some people, I don't know, maybe it's been a lifetime of, rah rallies and, American mega pastors and excess and maybe ordinary is what they need. So yeah, no, I'm glad you're doing work in that space, mate. I have so much respect for anyone in ministry. I've got people in my extended family in ministry, and especially doing it in times like these. Like, I just, take my hat off to you.
Oh, thanks. My little joke, depending on where people are engaging with my work, I do so many different things in so many different spaces, but, ministry is like my side hustle is my joke, which nobody would ever have that mindset. but it's kind of like the thing that I do on the side of
Yes.
all these other things. But also I suppose in some ways it's very primary because, again, I think the point of everything is to be in community where we learn together how to find wisdom in a world that feels deeply unsettling. And I think that that's what the great spiritual traditions have always offered, is a space of community seeking wisdom together. So yeah, it's sort of my side hustle, but it's also it is a place of expression of some of my deepest values.
Yeah, I think we could take a leaf out of our, Jewish brothers and sisters with like Midrash, this tradition of getting together and hearing, I guess, different perspectives and just marinating in questions and wisdom together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We'll come back to some of this talk a little bit later. I've got many more questions for you, Will. So you've made the national final of the Australian Poetry Slam 3 times now. And I want to ask you, what does that one night in October mean to you? Do you reckon there's some kind of like liturgical calendar of Australian Poetry Slam? And, is the APS final Christmas or whereabouts does it fit? What's the experience like? What's it been like?
Well, probably the most interesting thing for me is that there was a really big gap between the most recent time and the times when I was quite new to all of this.
Gotcha.
So I mentioned at the beginning that I had that teacher sort of encourage me to go and enter the heat of the Australian Poetry Slam. The first year I did that, nothing came of it. The second year I did that and I ended up going to the final and representing the ACT. And so I look back, and at that time I was desperate to win. Like, I thought, man, this would be so cool to win the Australian Poetry Slam. I'm maybe 19 years old at the time and think that I am the greatest gift to the world. I look back and I think, oh man, I'm so glad that I didn't win. That is not what my ego needed at the time, and it's not where my skill level was at. I then entered maybe 2 or 3 years later, and I got in through something that they don't do anymore, but at the time they had, and it might have only been that year, I don't know if they did it on any other years, but the ABC had a wild card entry slot. So I entered my local heat of the Australian Poetry Slam. I didn't get through, but you could literally call this ABC line and do a 2-minute voicemail of your poem.
Bring it back.
And then I was the one they chose as the wild card entrance, the ABC wild card. So that was kind of a cool novelty. But by that time, like, it was a couple of years later, and I think I had matured a bit. And so I was nowhere near as attached to my desperation to prove myself or to win. And it was a great experience. And then what happened is, I guess, it would have been like 12 or 13 years went by, and I hosted it. I hosted a heat for many years, like about 10 years. I was the one creating the space for others to enter. And you can't enter if you're one of the hosts.
Nah.
And I was fine with that because I was kind of a bit post-slam. I was like, I'd gotten to the point, and I think a lot of people do, this sort of, the whole slam gets people in because of the competitive element. People love a competition. But pretty quickly you realize that you either love poetry or you don't, or you just love a competition. And I love poetry. I'm a human, so I'm drawn to stadiums and glory and people, competing, whether it's cooking food or living in a house together. There's every way that we can possibly compete, every weird reality TV show we can come up with, we're into it. So I've got that, but I'm much more interested in poetry. So this is a long answer. But anyway, I finally got to the point where I said, I'm not hosting the heat anymore because my life is just too complicated. And somebody else stepped up, hosted the heat. So I thought, I could just go along and enter. and that was last year, it was last year. And so I entered and I did the thing, you go from the local heat to the New South Wales one. And then for the New South Wales one, the next night was the Opera House. And so it actually was quite significant for me looking back at the very different versions of me each time. It's not like I did this 3 years in a row. It's 3 times over 15 or more years. I guess poetry is an amazing way, I think. Over the more time that goes past, the more old journals you have or the more old embarrassing YouTube videos you have a record of yourself growing up. And there's a cringy element to that, but there's also like I'm grateful for every version of me that walked one more step towards this version of me. So I guess that's how I think about the APS final part of the story.
I totally forgot that the way it works in New South Wales is, you have the state final and then the national is the very next night often. Yeah.
And the wild thing about that is, again, it's all changed since, when I first entered, you could just do the same poem every time. You could, if you got a knockout poem, you just do it at your heat, you do it at the final. But whereas nowadays you've got to do a different poem at every stage. So, and you had to do 2. So the New South Wales final, 2 poems, and you're kind of thinking, I want to win this. I want to do the best poem, but I want to have my best poem left if I make it to the national final. So there's all those tricky considerations, but I was really happy because basically I got to do 3 poems. I have 3 kids and I kind of did a poem for each of them, which is a reflection of where I'm at these days. A lot of my poems, again, they're about the domestic stuff of life. But I was able to do poems that were very, of personal significance, which, that's a bigger win to me than anything else, really.
I know that you're mates with Rob Waters, who's the 2023 national champion, and everything that went down that year between him and KJ, who I've had on the podcast before, in terms of the double draw and then the double tie, I should say, and them deciding, okay, we're just going to have 2. We're getting kicked out of the Opera House in 5 minutes. So I love the element of improvising. That's so interesting about the ABC call-in. That absolutely should be a thing. There's nothing like a wild card. My wild card story is, having only been involved with kind of what was happening in Melbourne for maybe 6 or 12 months, getting into what was essentially like a showcase night, the Melbourne Spoken Word Prize in 2019 via Wildcard. And it was a thrilling night. I had to go last out of 25 people, which was oofed. It was thrilling, but it was also like my imposter syndrome had never been stronger. Because I didn't know who was who, and I'm thinking, okay, this is actually who's who and who does what. But a very, very valuable experience. Hey, quick pep talk. If you're enjoying the episode, I'd love it if you could leave a rating, review, comment, or like wherever you're listening right now. You know how this works. Every little bit of digital interaction helps people to find the show and keeps the poetry flowing. And if you want to do something extra special, please share the episode with someone who you think will vibe with it. That also helps with all of the above. Thanks so much for listening. And now back to our guest. All right, Will, I think we're ready for piece number 2, if you will.
I'll do one of the funnier ones in the book. There's plenty of ones that are kind of heavy, but this is a funny one. This is based on something that actually happened. But to anyone out there who uses ChatGPT, you may not be aware, but Claude is the better chatbot. I spend a fair bit of time talking to Claude, which is Anthropic's chatbot. And this poem's about a real conversation I had with Claude. It's called Home Economics. Consulted Claude about plans to expand our 3 better. 5 humans, 1 bathroom, we clash on the regular. But we love where we live and the home we've created. From the neighbours to the raised beds, all this life cultivated. Claude said, it's a no-brainer. Commence the expansion. Some clever architecture and it'll feel like a mansion. Supporting your family well into the future. What's holding you back? This plan's a sure shooter. I paused for a tick before I typed my reply. Admittedly giddy, thinking through grand designs. Well, to be honest, Claude, my biggest reservation is you. With AI on the rise, I wonder what will I do if my income is impacted in the next year or few as you gradually replace all the humans like me who make our living doing what you'll do for free. Claude pondered this, stand by, ruminating. Then the answer came quick, no need for more waiting. Well, Will, you seem like an agile guy, so no doubt you'll figure it out on the fly. But even if AI overlords do arrive soon, at least you'll have that second bathroom. Which, no joke, obviously it's not rhyming, but I was literally like talking about, we want to do this house reno and here's what I'm thinking. And, then I'm starting to get into it, but I'm a bit worried about whether or not we'll be able to make the repayments because I feel like everyone's going to lose their jobs in the next few years because of AI, blah, blah, blah. And literally like the level of black humor that this computer program can have, that it tells me, well, even if the uprising happens, you'll have a second bathroom. I just thought,
yeah,
you
what a
can't make that stuff up.
diversion from Claude. We're on to you. Love that. Yeah, obviously decisions to be made there outside of the realms of AI. Let's talk a bit more about Lead by Story, which is the creative agency that you're a part of. I want to know, like, what kind of briefs or stories do people come to you to work on? What one commission story felt like the biggest privilege for you to bring to life, would you say?
Yeah, well, the business that I run, Lead by Story, started 8 years ago, partly as my answer to how do I be a poet in the real world and make that a skill set that makes sense, I guess, in the marketplace, which immediately some people might hear that sentence and think, oh, what a sellout. But, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to sit in a log cabin and spend all your time writing poems. And I think that the reason that poetry has always been a part of human culture is because stories told through poems, songs, films, etc., have the power to change the way that we see the world and to create real change. So I kind of started this business basically thinking, how could I use, the skills of a poet, which I think are about, condensing and distilling messages of the heart to the fewest and best words and making every one of those words count. That's kind of what I think a poet does. So how can I take that skill and use that to help to create, more positive impact in the world? So the way that that's evolved is my team and I, we get to work with a whole range of people in either health, education, various kind of non-profits or social impact organizations. And we use, poetry and film and music and, audio, all the kind of creative tools at our disposal to try and help those organizations either raise awareness or raise funds or educate the community around something. So we've been able to do some amazing projects. I feel very privileged. Two real highlight ones that come to mind based on that question. One was a couple of years ago where I live here on the coast. As part of Homelessness Month, we got to be part of fitting out a shipping container with real audio stories of rough sleepers, basically sharing in their words, what their experience had been like and how they ended up in really challenging circumstances, but also about the strength and resilience that they have and just the fact that they're just human beings like you or I. And so the community often has a whole range of incorrect assumptions and opinions about how people might end up in that situation. And so the idea is that if you're a community member, you could walk into this kind of public installation, this shipping container, and just spend some time listening to real voices, real local people sharing their story, and hopefully walk out a little bit more empathetic, a little bit more educated, and maybe, give a few dollars to one of the local homelessness services actually helping people get back on their feet. So that was a really special project, and it won a local government award actually. And then one of the other projects that was very special, so I do a lot of work with Anglicare, one of the big providers of a whole range of social services, particularly the Sydney branch of Anglicare is who I work for. They have a big gala dinner in the middle of the year, big fundraising dinner. And a couple of years ago, they approached me and they said, we've got 500, generous community members in the room, people who have the power to give generously and really help create change, as well as a number of politicians and people in power. And the theme of that night was really around safe housing, particularly for women and children escaping domestic violence. And they said, we want people to connect with a real story, but obviously we don't want to put somebody in a position where telling their story, kind of brings up that trauma again or puts them at risk in terms of privacy. So how can we tell us a real story, but in a very creative way? And so I got to work with a few friends of mine, and I basically listened to somebody share their real story, and then we changed, the details that we needed to make it obviously sort of non-identifiable, and then we brought it to life in like a 3-act spoken word poem with music and films on screen in Sydney Town Hall. And the real story was actually about a mum and her kids who had been separated through a kind of, a DV situation. And so what I got to write was basically letters between the son and the mum while they were separated. And in the real story, as well as in obviously the creative retelling of it, they were reunited and put up in a safe, permanent house that they would still live in today. So yeah, it was really special to be able to tell that story, and over $1 million was kind of raised that night to go into more safe housing projects for people who really need it. So things like that, I'm like, man, I can't imagine finding a better mix of something that's creatively energizing, but is doing something in the world, and is sort of in the sweet spot of purpose and passion.
Absolutely. You've got that whole ikigai thing kind of going on, you know what I mean?
That's it, yeah.
And these stories that you're choosing to tell, like they're not vapid, they're really important, key social causes. So that's incredible to hear. As you were talking, I was reminded of the first time I read Donald Miller's Blue Like Jazz when I was 19. And, I think I reread it a few years ago and I was like, gee, this is a bit of a crock of wank, but gee, it was my crock of wank at the time. Like I had a real soft spot for it. But I'll just say, don't take a shot every time Donald says it's actually quite beautiful, or you might end up in trouble. Anyway, no, love Donald and love the book. But there's a point in the book where he talks about, being a writer himself, he talks about the elements of story having a specific universality to them, something very cross-cultural. When we talk about our lives, we understand our lives as a story, as a narrative. We know what setting is, what character is, what conflict is, and what resolution is. Do you think there's something to that? Do you think this is some kind of, I don't know. I think this is a big mystery. Like, what is this shared language that seems to go beyond English and foreign languages? Like, I don't know. Do you have any perspective on that, or is it just something that we need to sit back and just wonder at?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in this wildly unique position where we are self-aware creatures. Yeah. We have the ability to think about our experiences, and that's what. Our self-awareness is what sets us apart in some sense. I don't want to be all, like, humans are the best. All life forms deserve much more respect than we often give them. But by nature of the fact that we can think about our experiences, we then connect over our shared experiences. And even though there's a lot of different ways to be human, there seems to be some very common things that we all have to go through. Even like we sort of talked a bit before about that ache. Feels like if you live long enough, you experience ache. And if you try to go on whatever journey it is to meet that ache, that might lead you into some of those narrative structures where you find purpose in the journey, and you find, either what you were searching for eludes you, or you realize that, sort of like you said before, you come back to where you began and you realize that the thing that could satisfy that ache was almost where you started, So yeah, I think that's just part of what it means to be a human, wherever you come from, whatever you look like. There's this kind of journey, and our stories are often born from running away from ourselves or finding a home and a sense of peace, perhaps by returning to ourselves.
I'm just going to leave that in the air for a second. You mentioned before that you have 3 kids, you're a father. I imagine that not everyone has a father who is so immersed in different, aspects of art and self-expression. Are there any kind of things that you're doing to instill play and creation in the next generation? Because I feel like the powers that be out in the world, whether it's, markets or whatever, are very good at conditioning people very early on to be kind of passive consumers, right? Passive people. So I don't know, is this something that you think about? Do you think about how your kids might grow into some kind of passion in a similar way to yourself? Maybe not exactly the same?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there is a possibility that I'm like a terrible example to them because I'm doing so many different things and have such an unconventional career that, you know, it's they might rebel by getting some boring 9-to-5 job in the future. That would be like their rebellion against me.
Yeah. The irony.
I feel like it's so difficult. As soon as you become a parent, you realize the gap between your ideals and reality, right? And every kid's had the thought, I'm going to be a better parent than my parent was. Whether you had great parents or not, you know, we kind of all think, I'll nail this. And then you get into the situation and you're distracted and you're tired and you feel like all the things that you wish you could demonstrate are harder. And actually a lot of, I think, what you pass on is more small, ordinary stuff than big teaching moments. And so, yeah, at the moment, like I'm the coach of my middle son, Leo, his soccer team. And that is a place of play and creativity for me that, you know, is kind of completely unrelated to work and income and having to even be great. I don't even think I'm a good coach, but that's, you know, something that I think is really important. And then, yeah, I mean, definitely, I just think I do my best in ordinary moments, whether we're walking the dog or, you know, at the park, you know, on a swing, just to try and help them see the world with a sense of wonder. Because I think that is one of the biggest things that I'm still trying to teach myself and that I can pass on, like a sense, particularly in this day and age. I think the big competition for all of us is to try and win back our attention. You know, our attention is absolutely hacked and shattered to pieces, and everyone's trying to get our eyeballs. And so to kind of try within myself and then within the moments that I have with my kids to try and sort of like bring our attention to small, ordinary, beautiful things happening in real time is probably one of the big things that I'm not perfect at by any means, but that's, if I can help them to notice and observe life and beauty, then I will have hopefully done a good job.
Yeah, that's very well measured. I mean, you know, you don't come at this task with kind of massive, indulgent grand plans. You're really about the days will go fast. The days will go fast, but there can be something small in every day or every few days. I want to jump back into a bit of faith talk if we could. I always feel like I'm Stephen Colbert when I do this kind of thing in a good way. I think his show is going to be finished by the time this is out, so that'll be the end of an era.
Yeah.
I was looking at some old blog posts of yours. I wasn't stalking you or anything. I was just interested in what you have to say. And I found one where, you know, you were reflecting on faith and you had this really great quote, which felt very Don Miller-like, to go back to that well. You said, Jesus remains my model for being human in the way God intends. But increasingly, I feel like I'm trying to promote renewable energy while wearing the uniform of the big polluters. And I really loved that. It felt like something I could have written, you know. I just want to know, like, I just want to open the floor about, you know, do you have any other reflections about the intersection of, I guess, faith and creativity in your life?
Well, we could talk for a long time about that.
And we will.
Yeah. We live in interesting times, right? Because on the one hand, yeah, identifying with one of the big traditions, particularly the big C, Christianity, there's, like I said earlier, there's every reason not to. There's every reason to be embarrassed of that. There's every reason to hide that. And often that's kind of how I feel. Like, yeah, you know, I'm on the side of the good guys, but we're coming in and colonizing the planet. But we also live in a time where I think more and more people are really drawn to the transcendent and to answers that go beyond silicon, right? And, you know, like I think in some ways modern life has looked for answers beyond the wisdom traditions and found a lot of longing and a lot of lack. And a lot of what we've tried to fill the void with hasn't really worked. And I don't say that to try and, you know, sort of convert anyone to a faith system, because even within my own faith system, I still have plenty of existential angst and doubt, and I'm pretty open about that. But I guess I'm trying to tap into deeper wells. And, if we talk about the intersection between faith and creativity, both of those as actions, like as verbs, like I'm trying to embody the action of having faith and I'm trying to embody the action of creating. They are both about tapping into something deeper than yourself. They're both about going beyond your little ego. And to sort of go back to the awe and wonder stuff, like that feels like the appropriate response to, the universe that we live in. And I'm really, fascinated. A lot of my work over the last couple of years has kind of become circling around this idea of the overview effect, which is what astronauts experience when they go out into space and they look back at the Earth and they have this profound experience of seeing we live on this absolutely tiny, fragile dot surrounded by literally black space. And down there is the only place that we know of where there is life and waterfalls and, so many different species. And like, it's just incredible. And yet we spend so much time down here fighting and bombing each other and like, it's just wild, right? So I guess like part of that is just to say that I need the language. I need a spiritual language and I need creative practices to survive in that picture and to thrive. Like I need both of those things. So, and I think probably all humans do. There's different ways you can find that, but a spiritual language and creative practices, kind of survival tools.
And I'm sure having just had the crew of Artemis 2 splash down the other week, I'm sure they would be going through that whole experience of being some of the few people who've seen the Earth from that perspective. One thing that I often reflect on, and this kind of came out of my learnings, I guess, in my interest in, kind of counseling and therapy, if you like, the difference between like literal truth and functional truth. I feel like, a lot of the modern world is interested in literal truth. And there was certainly a point in my life where maybe my approach to faith was very much interested in literal truth. And, it was apologetics. It was being able to prove a set of suppositions or presuppositions. And I would never take that away from someone if that is something that brings comfort and strength and whatever. What I will say is I think the idea of functional truth, the idea of looking at a set of ideas or beliefs and actually thinking, what does this lead to? What fruit, if you like, does this lead to? Trying to take a functional, try and take a literal truth mindset to ancient scripture is going to trip you up because you're dealing with, a whole bunch of different genres and a whole bunch of different translations and perspectives. I think if we looked at more of life with functional truth and thought, like what do our beliefs result in? And is that a good thing for everyone, not just for us? I think that's a way more kind of expansive way of thinking about things. And, I'm planning in a few days' time, Will, I'm doing the Alpha course for not the first time in my life, but I feel like I'm going to be an absolute pain in the ass because I'm coming to it. I'm not mucking around. Like without going into too much detail, I've been through a lot in the last couple of months in terms of some loss and grief. And I'm kind of not mucking around with what I want to, with coming at things with that kind of functional truth lens of knowing that I'm not going into a room and coming out with an absolute airtight answer, but I'm interested to see, the people I meet along the way and what they could do. So hopefully, hopefully it'll be okay.
I love that, man. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your vulnerability and honesty around that as well.
No, likewise. As we get to the pointy end of things, Will, I want to invite you into the overarching creative analogy that we have for season 3, which surrounds the idea of colour. Will, if your creative work is a colour or a shade on the colour spectrum, what do you think it is and why?
Well, to go back to my not wanting to be too associated with the big polluters, I would hope that my creativity is green and generative and renewable. I hope that what I make leads to more. I always loved anytime I've hosted a poetry night and then someone came back the next time and said I left and I wrote something. That's like the best feeling, right? So yeah, I'll go with green.
Green it is. Forest green. Now, going to the segment which we've shamelessly ripped off Stephen and Diary of a CEO. We call it Diary of a POET. You've been left a question from my previous guests. So this question comes from Macho Makata, who asks, Will, what is the purpose of poetry to you?
Such a lofty question, isn't it? On the one hand, I think that purpose is really important. On the other hand, I think as soon as you start to try and define the purpose of something, it becomes pretty slippery. So I guess the purpose of poetry is whatever you need it to be at the time. When I was, a teenager, I needed it to be a place where I was figuring out, my teenage angst. At this point in time, it's a way of, reflecting on the different questions that I have as a dad, I guess. So yeah, if you're out there, poetry, the purpose of it is whatever you need it to be, not what somebody else needs it to be.
Yeah, it's functional in that way.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. Now you get the honour of leaving a question for my next guest, Sight Unseen. What would you like to ask?
My question is, what is the perfect day off for you? If tomorrow your schedule was cleared, you don't have any responsibilities, what would you do?
Beautiful. Yeah, can't wait to hear the answer for that. Someone's perfect Sunday, etc. Will, if people want to find out more about you, if they want to follow the various creative projects, the hodgepodge that you're involved in, or maybe they want to check out the new book, or maybe they want to find out more about Meeting Grounds, where are the best places for them to go?
So my stuff, you can just go to willsmall.com.au, and that does link to a few of the other things that I do, including Lead by Story and Spiritual Misfits, which we've mentioned. But yeah, if you're particularly interested in the podcast, you can look up Spiritual Misfits on, whatever podcasting platform you use, or you can go to spiritualmisfits.com.au. My name is a funny one to Google because it's the beginning of a question. If you Google Will Small, it will auto-predict questions that end with, will small things grow, or whatever you might write after that. So
I've got to try this. I've got to see what auto-predict does for me. Oh, well, the first thing that comes up is Will Smallbone, who's apparently a footballer. Oh, sorry, I'm doing it wrong. I have to type it in the actual thing. Will small profits be on BritBox? Will small hail damaged cars? Will Smallville ever return? That's
These are the big ones. These are the big important questions. We should have been discussing these all night.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. The name itself leads to more questions. I like it. Will, this has been an absolute pleasure, and we are going to sign off very soon, but not before we hear one last poem from yourself.
Andrew, I have two poems. I want you to choose on behalf of the audience which one you want.
Sure.
Given we've talked some theology, there's a poem about God having a crisis of faith, or if we want something a bit more tender and grief-related but beautiful, there's a poem about when we lost our family dog a couple of years ago. So a poem about God or a poem about a dog, basically, it's the same word backwards. So
yeah. Oh, wow. They both sound very touching. Let's go with the first one, though. Yeah, crisis of faith.
All right. I overheard God praying the other day. Chest heaving, heavy breath. I asked, "Are you okay?" And God said, "I think I'm having a crisis of faith." "Guess that makes two of us," I offered in reply. And we settled in the silence as the cosmos shuffled by. Kneeling, we traced in the dust like finger paint, etching little patterns as the daylight disintegrated. And God said, "I used to be a humanist. You were often on my mind. Now I'm becoming more a humanist, losing faith in your kind. Your existence is a question mark, hanging by a thread. Chatting with Nietzsche the other day, he quipped, 'Humanity is dead.' Unsure what to say, I tried to prove my existence, holding out my scars for God to place a finger in them. God laughed and said, 'Listen, belief is overrated, existence the wrong question. I am the ground of being, expressed in everything you see. There's nowhere you can look that isn't held within me. There is no separation between dust and divinity. And this isn't just a problem for the philosophically inclined. Here's the crisis of faith that breaks my body and my mind. When you cut down a forest, bomb a school, burn a hospital, when you lock up a kid facing unlimited obstacles in a system that makes other outcomes near impossible, you do it all to me. Then act like I'm responsible and wait for me to save you. Can you see how it's illogical? I don't give a shit if you believe in me or not, but something might be saved if every step you take as if you walk on God.
I'm glad I picked that one. That's beautiful, mate. Will Small, this has been such a treat. Again, I've kind of been wanting to reach out and have a chat for a long time. Thank you so much, so much, Will, for thinking with us and slamming with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Andrew. Keep doing what you're doing.
Weetabix hands, what's that all about?